All right. Well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Andrew Small, who is a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. His research focuses on U.S.-China relations, Europe-China relations, and broader developments in Chinese foreign and economic policy. Additionally, in the past, he was the director of the Foreign Policy Center's Beijing office, as well as a fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Australia National University's National Security College. Lastly, Andrew has also written various articles published in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and more, and is the author of the book, The China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics. So, Andrew, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
So, just starting off, how did you first get interested in Chinese foreign affairs?
I'd been in China before university teaching. When I started working in think tank world, which is early 2000s, it was quite clear that a lot of the approach to China at that time was still kind of premised on China of the 90s, China that was post-Tiananmen. Yes, lots of internal economic changes, but kind of quite domestically focused in terms of what people were thinking about, narrow regional focus. And the sense at that point was China's taking off as a global power. It's this juncture in the early to mid 2000s where it's become quite clear that it's crossed a threshold in terms of the global role that it's going to play already. Its economy is already going to be a certain sort of size, and it's going to start having an impact on more regions, countries, issues of the world than people had fully adjusted to. So at that time, I really wanted to start getting work put together, then in London, to start looking at that more seriously. I then decided to go out and do that from Beijing at a time where there weren't actually there was only kind of a couple of foreign think tankers out there, and that just seemed like the big story that everyone was going to be wrestling with for the next couple of decades. And I had a prior China interest, but my interest was as much, how is China going to change the world, rather than all of the other things I'd been interested in China internally. Sure. And all the cultural and all of that was the beginnings of the China real kind of power story that sucked me in.
Yeah, so I guess you really had the insight then to see like, okay, this is going to be a really big, important thing. I should get interested in and get focused on this topic. And obviously today it is constantly in the news. So looks like you chose the right path then.
But I think one of the things also is China's often in a kind of area studies box, particularly in the US.
Yes.
But not just in the US. You have people study China, North Korea, China, South Korea, China, Japan, at a push, China, Southeast Asia. But I think a lot of the gap in expertise tends to be more China. And in the mid 2000s, the Africanists weren't dealing with China as much. Huge kind of takeoff in the level of expertise at that time, again, just because of the impact people had to get their heads around it. Central Asianists have always followed China pretty closely, but South Asia was always a bit of a gap. China, Russia, people have followed. There's some fantastic experts, particularly actually Russian experts on the subject. But as you go around the world, the numbers of experts on these topics kind of tend to drop off. It's still tended to be in contained in expertise terms in kind of narrower parameters. And I think when you start to get more of these issues, either functional issues or China in parts of the world that people haven't really thought about, the pool of people working on these things just starts to become much smaller. So I ended up spending most of my time really looking at the areas that the area study specialists were not. So so it's a wide reach, but that's tended to be my focus.
Okay, that's interesting. So do you think then, like in the because it sounds like you've been doing this for a while now, studying China and their politics beyond the domestic level. Do you think there was a lag then in the West when it comes to focusing on China, and that people are still kind of looking at sort of Cold War era style political thinking internationally, and now it's just people are starting to catch on, like, hey, China is this next big thing. Did you see that then in your development? Because it kind of sounds like, given how people are grouping China still with, just like sort of different Asia studies programs, that and not focusing just on China, given how incorporated it is in everything in the world today. But
I think you basically get these threshold crossing moments. There's points where the particular scale of China economically and businesses, for anyone working in the trade world, there's a threshold that China crosses that just means it's being dealt with completely differently. There's a scale that China mattered at in the region where people had to start dealing with it very differently. I think it's rather that there are these issues where China doesn't matter at all, and doesn't matter at all, and doesn't matter at all, and then suddenly matters a hell of a lot. And they're the ones where there's a lag, partly just because if you're following one of these fields, China's totally irrelevant in some cases for significant period, totally marginal. If you're working on the Middle East, you don't have to think about, it buys energy resources and things, but it's not something that you need to get your head around. It used to be true in Africa. I mean, you go down the list, and it's completely understandable that the people who are working on some of these topics just didn't have to incorporate China in a really serious way into their thinking. And the challenge on this is that it tends to be only at the point where it suddenly starts to matter a lot that people fully start to get their heads around it. And this is true for China in some respects as well. I mean, they're coming to terms with their power position in some of these places, and they're not always used to the fact that people start taking much more seriously on some of these crises than they did even a few years earlier.
Yeah, I think there's always especially for emerging superpowers or countries that have already become superpowers, like, you kind of have to, once you step into that role, the world is all of a sudden much different than just someone that's just coming up. Everyone's thinking about you in a much different way. And that kind of brings us to where we are right now in the world, with Russia and Ukraine. Just out of curiosity, how long has China been developing ties with Russia? Is this a pretty recent thing, or has this been going on for many years now? Or,
well, I mean, it depends how far back you want to go, but let's just kind of wind back to the fact that, during the Cold War, you had this initially kind of Soviet-Chinese alliance and then you have this profound split between the two sides, and one can kind of go into the history of what this amounted to. But what it did as a consequence was, first of all, I mean, these were two nuclear powers that almost went to war at a certain juncture. This was the rift that, in a sense, the US, of course, through Kissinger and Nixon, were then able to kind of exploit in different ways as kind of part of the rebalancing of forces in the 70s and 80s, and importantly, even materially in places like Afghanistan, where you were extremely close Sino-US military cooperation to help bring down the Soviet Union. I mean, these for a period, these China and Russia were Soviet Russia were dead set against each other, and then you start to have, even under Gorbachev, a kind of a rebalancing of relations. I mean, famously, Gorbachev is visiting at the point where you have Tiananmen Square playing out as it is, and then you have a period of time where the two sides have all of this level of mistrust about each other. They've come to terms with a different sort of relationship, but you still have this kind of deep-seated sense that the two sides are still working as, in different ways, competitors, rivals, even in different parts of the system, enemies. They had been for some time, and then you get these different points at which things move and that starts to rebalance. And certainly you get this ideologically, I mean, even when I was in Beijing in the mid 2000s, you already had a sense of kind of ideological affinity building. You had this joint statement in 2005 at a point where you were getting these color revolutions, as they were dubbed, in Central Asia, where I think the two sides started to see that in terms of the common agenda that they had against Western liberalism and the pernicious influence of Western values, they were kind of standing alongside each other. But really the breakthrough point for the two sides is after the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, where you have all of the doubts, concerns, residual mistrust, particularly on the Russian side. They're prepared to put it aside just because of the very immediate and pressing need to build a different quality of relationship, because they know that China can come in economically to help out in different ways, in a context in which the economic relationship with the West has not completely collapsed, certainly not in energy terms, but in various other areas. And you start to get this rethinking on the Russian side at that point of all of these kind of longer term issues back to the territories that Russia had acquired, and but this concern about, for instance, the Russian Far East and the role that China might play there, and whether you go back to some of those old territorial questions. Russia's prepared to set some of these things aside and becomes more sanguine about the risks of Chinese population moving in and these sorts of things. They decide that they're willing to sell them advanced weapons in a way that they hadn't been before, because yes, they knew that the Chinese may well rip these weapons off and sell them elsewhere, but they started to see this diminishing window where they could still achieve benefits in the weaponry sales, because the PLA was advancing so fast itself. But it came about out of necessity really after 2014. Whereas from China's perspective, they'd seen Russia as kind of a prize in some respects. If you can get Russia on side, that really changes the strategic equation for you. And there's been debates about that. If you look at all the discussions on the Chinese side, as they become a global power and they're looking around at who can be friends and partners and allies and things, Russia's in a kind of unique category. But as with many of the other countries that China deals with that are potential friends, there's lots of risks attached to that, precisely because Russia is a risk-taking actor in a way that China, time is on its side. It thinks it can afford to be much more patient. But Xi Jinping, particularly, he takes his first trip to Russia. It seems that he personally sees value, both for ideological reasons and strategic reasons, in fixing this relationship, treading incredibly carefully in terms of kind of the face given to Putin and to Russia generally. And that there's something that is worth bending over backwards for in a way that he's not been prepared to do in virtually any other relationship to this extent. And in that period from 2014 to today, you get all of these moves between the two sides that take it to a place that means that when you got this joint statement on February the 4th and Putin visiting during the Winter Olympics, it's kind of the culmination of a joint effort on both sides to build a relationship that starts to look like a sort of ideologically driven global partnership that goes beyond just overcoming some of the barriers in the bilateral relationship that had been there and starts to look as if it's going to amount to something much more. Then we have what has played out, and we can talk about how this changes that set of calculations or not.
Yeah, I mean, it just seemed like, just at least on the surface, they both have a fair amount in common at this point in time, with being kind of hesitant about working with the West much because of Western values, and being countries that are kind of really propel for this sort of authoritarian nationalism, and you can see that there's a lot of commonalities between the way the governments function and with how they're trying to run their societies with when it comes to okay, what are we going to allow in terms of like speech and everything else. On the surface level, there's that, and they're of course have lots of issues with the West over disputes like Ukraine or Taiwan. So there can be kind of these similarities you can see where they would find like, okay, we have enough in common where we can work together on something. Now, I guess the question that I think everyone's been really interested in is, how much did China know about this potential invasion of Ukraine before it happened? What is your take on that?
So on that, there's a degree of speculation still about it. There's intelligence that's been released. There's in particular this claim that the Chinese communicated to the Russians that whatever military action they did take, they should only take after the Olympics and things like that. But I think two things on this. First of all, it's clear that the Chinese did not expect a full-scale war. I think that is, I think, kind of an accurate assessment. Why they didn't expect a full-scale war? My understanding of this would have been that if you base it purely on the assessments that China would make, regardless of what they were told in advance, my understanding is that they would have believed that any Russian intervention would have been a kind of short, sharp, effective operation of the sort that, as far as the Chinese were concerned, they had conducted in Crimea. In Syria, one's more drawn out, of course, but as far as the Chinese were concerned, the Russians had shown themselves capable. To a certain extent, although the Chinese weren't big fans of it at the time, given that it took place during the Olympics, the intervention in Georgia as well in 2008. So I think the sense is, if Russia did intervene, it would look something like this. If they didn't, then they were building up all of this coercive pressure with the assembly of all of the forces on the borders, both with the Russian border and with Belarus, to create pressure to coerce all sorts of concessions, they hoped, from Ukraine, Europe, the US, in different ways. So, if you were looking at it from the Chinese side at that point, you probably saw one of those two outcomes. Either the West and Ukraine back down and give in to various Russian demands, or you get some kind of lightning strike operation, which, even if you had any sharing of information and preparatory material from the Russian side, that appears to be what they wanted to do. As we've seen what they were expecting. So if they worked on the basis of what the Russian expectations were, then it would have looked something like that. Not that there would have been what we have then seen playing out. So I think, you had an op-ed from the Chinese ambassador Qinggang in the US just the other day saying, we didn't know this was coming and we would have prevented it. And you can there's a lot of playing with what it is was understood and believed. We know, of course, that the US was really trying to share as much material as possible with them to say that this is coming, and I think in some cases, there is a channel. Putin's not talking to many people right now. He might actually listen if China did express some concern about this. And I think, it was quite clear that they shared the intelligence with the Russians. They said they didn't believe it, and they weren't going to let the two sides be divided, and things like that. And I can understand why they would have disbelieved, and they would have seen this as disinformation efforts to sow dissent between the two sides and things like that. But they didn't know. It's very, very hard to believe that they knew nothing at all about what was coming. They just hoped it would be successful. That's what I think. They hoped Russia would succeed in a more painless way than they have. And that's what I think their position was going into this, because they were getting all sorts of entreaties from people ahead of the the summit or the visit from Putin at the beginning of February, we were in full crisis mode. It was absolutely clear that all of this stuff was playing out. So they knew something was going on. The only question was, what was it that it amounted to?
Right. Yeah. No, that makes total sense, because it's obviously has no benefit to anyone for this to go so badly, for Russia's military. And if you're China, you're thinking what did we just sign up for? Like, you guys, what are you doing here? It's like, this is a disaster. And it seems like China's kind of trying to distance itself a little bit, to a certain extent, sort of, but at the same time, not too much so where it's like abandoning, Russia, trying to basically, implement sanctions or something like that on Russia to stab them in the back or something. But yeah, it definitely makes sense that there wasn't a clear understanding that this would happen the way it did, and China's taken by surprise, like everyone else, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, this is then the thing, and I mean, who go down the list of all the things that have played out. What were the predictions in terms of the capacity of the Ukrainian side to fight back as effectively as they have? What were the predictions about the efficacy of the Russian military operation? Did not look like this. What was the expectation when it came to the collective response from the West, particularly the scale of the sanctions that have been undertaken? No, not even none of the leaders themselves believed that they would end up in this place. Again, if you were going through the sort of estimates on the Chinese side, I mean, it was very reasonable that you wouldn't have expected a series of things to play out the way they have. I think they also didn't expect the exodus of Western companies, and this has been one of the things that has been particularly disturbing. The companies that are leaving Russia are not just, of course, leaving Russia because of the difficulty in transacting in dollars or specific sanctions. Everyone is just clearing out and writing off prodigious sums of money in the process. And that's and they see this kind of cascade, and on the Chinese side, that's the fear. The idea was always, in the end, that the sums of money that were at stake in China, the size of the market, all of these things would mean that if anything played out, in the end, the companies would still kind of swing in a certain way, and they'd still lobby behind the scenes to make sure that nothing happened to impair. And you're seeing companies write off double-digit billions of dollars of losses. And that, I think, is concerning, because the momentum on this is just a market and firm level set of decisions that are not being taken in DC or Berlin or Brussels or wherever else. And I think that's one of the things that gives some additional pause in terms of seeing how quickly these things can move when China itself is thinking about some of the options that it has, and that's been the collective response from the West in its totality. And again, the interesting thing by comparison with 2014 was it's not just the US and Europe. The sanctions, you have Japan, you have Singapore, you have Taiwan, you have not even, again, to go into the inordinately large group that voted the UN General Assembly, and some of the statements, not just the famous one from the Kenyans, the Security Council. I mean, you've had a collective response, which, see how long that group holds together. But this has been a kind of coalition in response to what's played out that is something that I think, from China's perspective, is also both something they hadn't expected and concerning, because this is the calculation. I mean, of course, Taiwan is the obvious reference point, but in any of these scenarios, the question is just how resilient are you in dealing with these situations if you decide that you're going to there's some form of military action you have to take, and it does not look, I think, where China had expected it to look. Some of the actors that they would have expected would be reliable friends in this situation have looked like they might be much more unreliable in depending on what sort of situation they're dealing with. So it has had real resonance in terms of, and we'll see all the calculations and debates and things that play out on the Chinese side, but as they're thinking about their future positioning as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the mass exodus of companies, I think kind of took everyone by surprise a bit. But also, it's been interesting because, throughout history, we've never had a society this globalized, and to see an invasion of that scale happen in 2022 and seeing, how that plays out when you have this incredibly connected world economy, it is really fascinating to see just how quickly you could be cut off from that system in so many ways. It's just unbelievable to see like what's happened with Russia's economy, and now facing questions of like defaults and all sorts of things. I'm sure for China this is like, wow, like, okay, this is not a game. So,
and you think that scale protects you, and that because all the sanctions efforts have gone through these kind of increments at different points. Lots of the techniques started with North Korea. It moved on to Iran. You particularly the financial sanctions efforts, because that's the difference between the sanctions, the kind of broad-based sanctions that were targeted, not even really targeted at all. They hit the population. In different ways, what we were dealing with Iraq in the 90s. Go through the history of sanctions essentially before the mid 2000s, and then you have this realization that actually you press certain nodes and the system reacts in different ways. You don't even in some cases need to you don't need to take responsibility for all of the actions yourself. It will be compliance departments in banks. It will be companies shifting their risk assessments. It will just ripples out. And that's the thing that's kind of built piece by piece. And at each point, you've had people saying, well, the economic interests with X are too big. They obviously weren't with North Korea, but with Iran, you still have this question. It's a big oil exporter, gas exporter. But it was not too big in the end. People just had to adjust to that. Russia, then, that was a real question already in 2014. Is Russia too big and a systemically integrated actor? And in the end, those sanctions were weaker. And this creates, and I think that in some respects is what China had thought at the time, that if you got a repeat of the 2014 sanctions, they can live with that. That's okay. If China has to navigate that in future, well, it's a bit difficult it will make things more complicated, but it's manageable. And this goes so far beyond that. And is this willingness of a whole series of actors to varying degrees take a real hit? And I think we've been in sufficiently volatile times in the last few years that people are willing to people have in one way got used to having to write down vast sums of money, come up with alternative financing mechanisms for things that they didn't have to imagine, deal with debt differently. I think the economics of this and the relationship between politics and economics has changed as well. I think there are things that people are just accepting they will deal with differently, and it's not absolutely impossible to contemplate some of these things happening. And I think that for China and seeing what's happened in this instance just shifts a level of the security that they have, that they were just going to keep becoming more resilient, more capable, at some point almost impregnable, because of the interest that they would bind into their economy, and that no one would be willing to unravel. And China's a much bigger and more integrated actor, there's no question. It would be much more painful to do to China what we've done to Russia, but they have to think about that differently now.
Yeah, it seems like the world has kind of changed over the last few weeks when it comes to geopolitics and all the different potential factors at play now that people are going to be thinking about in the future. Um, to what extent do you think China may try to soften the blow on Russia from sanctions, or are they going to stay out of that? What do you think is their thinking process on that position?
I mean, I think the main thing is they want to avoid damaging spillover for their own companies and economy. And so, I mean, again, winding back to 2014, sanctions adherence from lots of the economic actors on the Chinese side was relatively good. They stuck to the letter of the law. Sometimes the Russians complained that some of the Chinese banks were more robust in their enforcement of these things even than some of the Europeans, because the cost in terms of cut off from the system is too great. And I think you're already seeing that. You're already seeing that from the Chinese commercial banks. You're already seeing that with some of the difficulties in financing even oil transactions. And I think when it comes to the technology firms, you're probably going to get the same thing, that you're going to these are firms that make so much money from the Russian market relative to others. They're very global. They're still hugely dependent on US technology. So there's going to be all of these commercial actors in different ways, even state-owned, but kind of global, commercially minded actors that in the end do not want to take the risk of being cut off, particularly from US IP, US tech, US component, or all of the other things that this would involve, the US financial system, all of that. And the financial piece and what you're seeing on the export controls regime is kind of at the crux of that. But I mean, China does not want Russia to fail. There are going to be areas in which, I mean, what you essentially had in the aftermath of 2014 was the state banks, that is Exim and the China Development Bank, the ones that are just direct state lending rather than some of the sort of quasi-commercial banks like Bank of China and some of these things. They provided lots of the financing to Russia. They provided financing for the big transactions, the energy transactions, and some of the other investments that took place. And they made sure that money was funneled to people around Putin who needed it, and were very kind of targeted about all of that. And that was just essentially the Chinese state. And they're actors that are much harder. Those are entities that are just much harder to sanction in the same way. They're not impossible to sanction. And essentially the US side has been going to the Chinese and saying, look, we saw what you did after 2014. We saw every single area where you swung in to support Russia. If you do any of these things this time, we will go after you. And this is the thing where there's kind of the question is, what level of pause does that give? Can you even create complications for areas of support that China did extend in the aftermath of 2014? Because you can sanction these individuals, you can make things more complicated even for some of the policy banks in various ways, and that's kind of a question still, because there's going after Chinese actors specifically in that regard with sanctions, or there's just how far do they adhere to the actual sanctions regimes that are in place. Because for now, Russia can still export foodstuffs, it can still export energy. No, this is not being blocked. So China can still transact in lots of, it's made much more complicated by everything that's going on with on the financial side. But there's reasonable grounds to think that they'll stick to the letter of the law, but they'll try and find other ways around that. But the question is just what that scale amounts to and when. Yes. Because I think right now they're feeling the heat. And the most likely thing is they will try and keep their heads down for a while. I mean, we had this story about Russian requests for military support, for instance. I mean, the two sides have a military relationship. Typically the other way, the Chinese buying things from the Russian side, but there are areas in which Russia sees kind of specific things that China has that may be useful. And that rebalancing was always going to go in another direction at a certain point. At some point, I mean, again, China wants Russia to have a capable military. They will, I'm sure, provide that support at the right moment. But this is a difficult spot. And this is the thing that, again, the US has been doing with all of the intelligence on these things, is just pushing the thing out very actively, sharing it with allies, but sharing lots of it publicly very quickly, and thereby putting China under a lot of pressure that there are things that previously had been much more below the radar screen that are instead, even before they happen, even when in this instance you're getting requests coming in, it's out there in public. And this is that, so they're quite on the back foot with this. This is there are forms of support, therefore, that they know are going to be extremely politicized extremely quickly. So I think they're going to tread quite carefully in the near term on this. Over the longer arc, then I would expect them to find ways to swing back in once people have stopped paying the same level of attention. But they're still going to pay more attention than they used to. And that's the difficulty that China's going to face. They're having to own the choices of this relationship in a way that they didn't before.
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of just raises questions about, like, to what, how strong will this relationship be in this sort of alliance that they have? Because, I mean, if you're the Chinese government right now and you're seeing how this operation, the special military operation, is going down for Russia, you're kind of thinking like, okay, the Russian government appears to be pretty reckless and ill prepared for what they're trying to do, and not necessarily all that good at informing us exactly what's happening either. So, you wonder if China, looks at this in the long term and thinks like, okay, we can have a relationship with Russia because, as you're talking about, they obviously have interest in keeping the Russian government afloat and functioning. But at the same time, how deep will those interests go, considering that, there's potential for that to backfire, I guess, on China by working too closely with someone who's clearly showing to the world that they're having major issues with lots of different things.
So, I mean, this is going to be a difficult set of calculations, I think, on the Chinese side, because if you go and look at a lot of the other relationships that are comparable that China has, look at the relationship with North Korea, look at the relationship with Pakistan, look at the relationship with Sudan, look at the relationship with Zimbabwe. I mean, you can go down a list, but essentially at different junctures, Myanmar at certain points too, there are points in which China has had friends, kind of friendly countries, have had a close relationship with it, who've then taken action that people have started to hold China accountable for, and have started to ask China to swing in, started to ask them to help in different ways, at least rein in some of the most problematic elements of these states' behavior. And China's not walked away from these countries in the end. They've the difference, and the interesting thing when people were talking about mediation and things like that, was that China would kind of say to the US, to others, this is a bit embarrassing, we don't like what they're doing, we can let's compare notes a little bit on that, maybe we do need to rein this in a bit. And then they'd go to these countries and there were points in which they would exert different forms of pressure on them. The difficulty is, I think, that Russia is far too close to being a peer actor. And I mean, you can say all this stuff about, it's a junior partner. I mean, China doesn't behave. And one of the reasons the relationship has worked well in the last few years, China does not push Russia around and treat it as a junior partner. And in various areas, they're not. There are all sorts of things that the Russian side is far more capable of, and particularly, despite what we've seen in the last period of time militarily, the PLA has not fought a war since 1979, sort of a not particularly large-scale war even at that. I mean, they're very inexperienced militarily, and that's one of the reasons that they, I think, have valued the potential and actual partnership with Russia. They do want to get better at doing all of these things, but I mean, there are certain areas in which they're not going to treat Putin or Russia in general as they would Kim Jong-un or Bashar al-Assad. So I mean, there are, but I mean, what you still get from these cases is China does not walk away from these countries. It does not do some kind of we're being tainted by association with this kind of motley crew. I mean, they've stuck with them in much weaker positions because they've seen there to be strategic value. They've found ways to maneuver around what's going on. The interesting thing about this case is because of the scale of what Russia's doing, and precisely because it is so much more a much more powerful actor, the level of kind of mobilization around this, the seriousness with which it's being taken, the sense that you have actors swinging in to say, and of course, relations with the US have gone where they've gone already, but on the European side as well, saying this is going to be extremely costly for your relationship with us if you, even if you take a position of this sort of pro-Russian pretend neutrality, but we're going to watch everything that you're doing, and if you line up in a particular way, it is going to have costs. And I think this is posing, I think, different questions for China. There's more. This, I think, has become far more costly than they had expected, but I still think that on the fundamental analysis that says China and Xi Jinping believe themselves to be in a strategic contest with largely the United States and allies of various weight. And in that contest, they need to deal with the negative fallout. Yes, they still need to maintain certain forms of economic relations for the sake in the coming years of their own need to access a whole series of things that I think they still, in the end, hope to transcend beyond needing to get access to semiconductors. They hope to get beyond a situation in which the global financial system can be weaponized against them. All of these things there, but they're not there yet, and so they still need to be able to maintain a certain base in terms of what relations with the US and the West more broadly look like. And so this is already posing them more difficulties than they had expected, even if you were to put Russia against a number of these other countries. I think they will just, for now, I think they will step aside and they will try and do damage limitation. My expectation still in the end is they will provide the same form of support to Russia that they've been willing to do to far lesser and less valuable partners. And I think they know that some of the decisions that they've taken, they leaned in a little bit too far. They're having to bear more of the cost of this than they'd expected. But I think that they're just going to suck some of these things up and figure out how to kind of minimize the damage. But I don't think this is a relationship they think makes any sense to walk away from. It would leave them even more exposed, I think, as far as they're concerned. And Xi Jinping's been very personally associated with this. It would be kind of a repudiation of his foreign policy strategy in general to do this at just the juncture, just the year in which he's going for the unprecedented, in the sort of post Deng Xiaoping era, a third term. And there are more kind of question marks, of course, around various things that he's been doing in the last period of time. But I think walking away from this is still something that's too difficult, even for him personally.
Yeah. Now, I mean, that completely makes sense. Sort of pivoting a little bit. Now, I know we often talk about like, the West and China, or the West and Russia, but to what extent does China and Russia themselves between each other have competing interests today? Now, obviously, Russia may not be able to do much with those competing interests, I suppose, given what's happened recently with Ukraine, and I'm not sure what they're going to be doing in the future or what Russia is going to look like exactly. But hypothetically, if Russia comes out still functioning as it did before after all this, to what extent is there potential for sort of flare-ups between China and Russia over I don't know, things like the Arctic or other competing interests around the world today?
So, I mean, there were the traditional issues in the bilateral relationship, um, which were things around the Russian Far East, in particular, and to some extent, there were other kind of how the mistrust between the two sides translated in terms of the economic relationship. I mean, you still had, in one sense, a Western orientation that said, on Russia's part, you get better technology, you get better uh, quality, you get better price. I mean, there are all of these reasons why you don't want to be kind of stuck, too beholden and too dependent on the China relationship, but for all sorts of ways economically. And lots of that shifted. The classic thing that was always put up was Central Asia. They have different interests in Central Asia. Russia will be uncomfortable with China swinging in, but that too, I think you've increasingly seen. Yes, they have slightly different interests, but not so different. I mean, in the end, China's willing to defer to Russia on certain things. They're happy for Russia to have a security role. That's I mean, there are points in which China, I think, thinks a bit more should be done, and they have kind of stepped in a little bit themselves in Tajikistan and one or two other cases. But fundamentally, they don't have any ideological opposition. They can fix some of the nuances of this, and there is a fundamental issue there, which is just a Russia adjusting to the realities of Chinese economic power and trying to make the best of it, and figuring out a political and military relationship that means that the two sides do not end up competing or at odds in these places. And both of them want to fix that, and both of them have been able to fix it. And the embodiment of this, of course, on the bilateral side is, you know, the Russian capacity to move so many of its forces from its eastern military districts bordering on Mongolia and China to be able to participate in this. So you've had bilateral piece, you've had Central Asia as one of the external pieces. I think you still tended to have this reciprocal thing that says Chinese interests in Europe look different, Russian interests in Asia look different. Russia has close relationships, particularly with Vietnam and India, which, you know, are, if you were to pick states in the region, among the most kind of problematic relations that China has. They're selling them all sorts of, particularly India, advanced military equipment that has direct consequences for China's security interests. But similarly, Russia has a diverse set of interests in Asia that do not look identical to China's. And in Europe, Russia has a whole series of things that they want to achieve that can cause China problems, because China wants to maintain good relations with a lot of European states too. What you had that was the biggest difference with the joint statement on February the 4th was this sense that the two sides would start giving each other a bit more support in respective areas in a way that had not been the case before. It was essentially, previously, we will help provide a mutually enabling environment for each other. We will have a bilateral relationship that is sort of mutually empowering. And yes, we'll coordinate in the UN and we'll coordinate in certain places, but there are going to be regions that we just don't touch. We don't work together in these. We know our interests are different, but that's fine. If we sell you advanced fighter aircraft, and that helps you in Taiwan contingencies, but even with Vietnam or India, that is its own thing. If we send you missile defense systems, same thing. But that's not because we're going to align with you on your position in the South China Sea, and we're not going to align with you on a whole series of other positions that you take in Asia. What you got with this joint declaration was a thing that said, you know, I mean, AUKUS was one focus. China providing support to the Russian proposals, these two kind of treaty drafts that they put together last December that were basically a rollback of the post-Cold War security order to, you know, before NATO expansion. This was the new thing. This was the thing where the two sides start to support each other. And the concern, if you're India, for instance, is, or Vietnam, that as a result of everything that's played out, you will start to get China weighing in on these things in a different way, and that will be part of the reciprocal expectation for the forms of support that China has in different ways extended to Russia in this, even if only rhetorically, but even in some of the positioning. If China now turns around and says, we do not want you to sell the following things to the Indians, for instance.
Yeah.
That's something where, you know, the Indians thought they had all these guarantees from Russia on that. And, you know, the new situation may simply demand that they don't get some of those things. And at worst, that Russia complicates the picture for them by, you know, not it becomes harder to get repairs for the things that they've already committed to, and spare parts and and all of this thing. And meanwhile, the person who was in Russia on the day the invasion was launched was Imran Khan. And the Chinese have also been working quite closely to sort of do better networking with some of their other partnerships and kind of try and pull Russia away from India and develop the relationship with Pakistan. And so I think in principle, they do have different interests in these regions. Russia wants a much more autonomous set of relations in Asia. China doesn't want to be stuck with all of the manias in some cases that Russia has about its relations, particularly with various Central and Eastern European states. It doesn't want to be attached to that. But they've crossed a threshold on this where China may still try to find ways to distance itself a bit from some of this. And I think, I mean, we have an EU-China summit coming up, and there's going to be various interactions in the next stretch where the Europeans are going to be saying, did you mean this? What does this amount to, that you're going to be backing the Russian position on these things?
Yeah.
And I mean, the Chinese for now are pretty much saying, it's just about the Americans. If you get the Americans out, it's no problem, it's fine. But I mean, that's these are the fundamentals of European security at the moment. So you have some questions around that, but certainly a Russia that emerges in a weaker position, China will have some different requests that will come in, almost certainly, when it comes to how Russia approaches things in Asia. I mean, the big thing in the end is most relationships that are close relationships with China, countries kind of chafe at them a bit if it gets too close. They don't. China's not the most comfortable partner to have in most cases.
Yeah.
I mean, the opening to when Myanmar sort of normalized relations. I mean, it's gone backwards since, but when there was the opening that they undertook, it was just because they were kind of sick of the Chinese, partly as well. And I think there's still a question about, do you just get a chafing at the position that you find yourself in as Russia, stuck dealing with China on some of these terms? China's still, though, with Russia, and whether they'll be able to maintain this, they've been so careful with this. They know that it would be easy to elicit a response that is precisely this: stop pushing us around, stop acting like you're the senior partner, kind of thing with it. How long they're able to hold that together, who knows? But I mean, one of the famous things that happened after 2014 was all the Chinese companies going in to negotiate with Russia in the middle of all the sanctions. And Xi Jinping called lots of them in and basically said, look, do not treat Russia like it is like their backs are against the wall and that you have to squeeze out every possible concession. Do good deals, don't not negotiate seriously, but also don't create the impression that this is a fire sale and that you're really squeezing these people, because we have higher interests that are involved here than just you getting a somewhat better deal on some of these negotiations. And I still think that mindset will play in here in a way that it hasn't in some of these other cases. But they'll need to be able to hold that together, because I think the issue is not so much are the deep essential clashes in some of these third areas, but rather how much resentment builds about the terms of the relationship, and how far do people on the Russian side think this is not, in the end, and also in the end, we don't want to be a sort of super North Korea. We don't want to be in this framework with the Chinese. This is not the club that we should be stuck with. And I think that's the thing that becomes more powerful, not just not at the leadership level, but at other points in the Russian system, which in different ways have been very skeptical about China. And then I think in an underlying way necessarily see this as the future, but at the moment this will happen out of necessity, and we'll see
Yes.
what level of adjustment people just find themselves having to accommodate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key point. It's just like, this is right now, Russia and China find themselves close together because this is just how the world is working right now for their government interests. But, from my experience being in Russia and talking to Russians, I never got the impression that they would feel more comfortable sort of being in a Chinese orbit versus like a European one. I feel like a lot of Russians think of themselves just like, Europeans in general. So culturally, I think that would be a big adjustment for Russian society to really move dramatically towards China. But I guess we'll see what happens with everything going on.
In other cases too, I mean, even when that doesn't happen, there just becomes the combination of the political, how geopolitics moves, how the economic circumstances present themselves. There are just contexts in which people are kind of stuck with this, and I think you don't necessarily need to get a deep cultural affinity or reorientation. I mean, I've followed this particularly closely in the case of, for instance, Pakistan, where there's this deep security relationship that used to be handled just by kind of a tiny number of people on the two sides, and it's really just about the really kind of also the deep underlying structure that means that China's helping to provide Pakistan with its missile technologies, nuclear technologies, but I mean it's not a close day-to-day relationship. There's no affinity. There's no
best friends.
China. But it doesn't mean that that doesn't end up being the way you end up as Pakistan as the security relationship that you're increasingly relying on because of a whole series of different other related dynamics. And then in the end, that becomes this thing, and seen in the last few years, people are just having to try and find ways to adjust around some of this and make the best of it. And that's I mean, whether that happens on the Russian side or whether part of the byproduct of all of this is that at some point this snaps, and in the end they're not like for like authoritarian systems. I mean, they're very very different in so many ways. And so I mean, one does not want to kind of blob these two countries together artificially in wherever the leaders are at on this.
I mean, they both kind of have some general interests in common, but they're not by any means very very similar countries or anything. So and I could imagine also, given how much the Russian government has promoted itself as, and it has been a major world power and military wise, it would just seem strange for them to be kind of like a vassal state of China or something like that and rely on China for security. It's like Russia has always been able to secure itself, for all these years. That would just seem embarrassing for, I think, Russian leadership. But so thinking about China and its relationship with Taiwan, how does China sort of recalculate its interests with Taiwan based on what it's seeing with the Western response and I guess, really global response towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Now, how does China sort of think about, what it wants to do with Taiwan in the future based on everything it's learned from sort of Russia's ambitions recently?
So, I mean, I think you already had a context where military operation was difficult inherently. I mean, certainly like full amphibious landing, takeover, all of this sort of thing. That was very difficult. And going back to the fact that China hasn't fought wars in the last period of time, and that is a particularly difficult form of war to fight, harder than a land invasion of Ukraine. So I mean, that was already a kind of, how difficult is this? Also with guaranteed or very close to guaranteed American involvement and Japanese involvement and others. So it's a different thing to take on. So some of these things were this was already true, that this was difficult in a different way. And I mean, there have been all of these debates on what the kind of time horizons are on the Chinese side for when they might consider trying this, and also what this would look like, because there are, of course, ways of coercing Taiwan short of an invasion, blockades and things like that. And
Yes,
but
exactly. Yeah.
so I mean, and of course, China's objective on this would always be, how are you able to achieve the outcome without having to go ahead with a full-scale war? And that, I mean, going back to the Russian example, I mean, if you're able to essentially coerce the sides into the other side into whatever forms of concession and keep doing this without having to fight, I think that would still in many ways be China's preferred outcome. But that looks harder
Yes.
now, because also I think there's more of a realization, not just on the Chinese side, but on everyone else is looking at this, that you can have overwhelming military force arraigned against you, but having gone through the experience of this being true with insurgencies that the US has had to deal with,
Yep.
There's been this odd level of confidence in one way that that if some of these other powers act, they're not going to have to deal with the same or worse. And it is worse because the difference between the kind of quality of equipment, intelligence support, and things like that Ukraine is being provided with versus the Taliban or any of these other cases that you could look at is sort of worlds apart.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And you look at what Taiwan would be in a position to do in that regard. And I think, I mean, there will be you can see what a kind of and I mean, of course, if you're looking at in Ukraine, I mean, of course, what you've had with the number of people who've been rotating through, having to deal with the conflicts in the east of the country and things like that. I mean, you've had a different level of kind of what that society looks like versus what Taiwanese society looks like. And I mean, you of course can't do kind of, there are all sorts of innumerable ways that these are not like for like, but you can see how resilient our population can be, including when they are armed with the capabilities to deal with and neutralize some of the obvious things that they'd be dealing with in circumstances of a Chinese invasion. You also, of course, see the consequences of being able to win the information battle. And right now, you have an incredibly adept Taiwanese government as well. I mean, this is a difficult government for China to have to take on. This is not Chen Shui-bian, who people thought was a bit too risk-taking, and it's not a version of the KMT, a bit too kind of, does not have this kind of savvy and kind of democratic, lively quality. I mean, but all of the things that this government is really good at on the Taiwanese side are things that mean that you would know that, and China's also much less capable of some of the kind of information warfare stuff than Russia. And you've seen what happened to Russia in this context. See, you've got all of that. You've got the fact that certainly the sanctions have gone much further than China had expected. And so they would have to factor in now the possibility that they would deal with having their central bank sanctioned, having companies pull out, all of these things on a scale that I think is just much further than they had envisaged. So, I mean, and you can go down a number of other things on this list too. I think even in terms of calculations for the involvement of other actors, I think, for instance, that there would be more questions for them about whether a much larger European role on the economic side in terms of kind of countermeasures and things as a result of this. I think they've kind of written off what the European role in some of these things might ultimately amount to, and it looks much more difficult for them. So the net effect, I think, is it gives more pause. I mean, there were reasons to be apprehensive about trying to conduct an operation there anyway, but there was a lot of chatter and there was a lot of kind of question about whether Xi Jinping wanted to do this as a legacy issue, maybe in 5 years or whatever time frame people were talking about. There were certainly risks through to 2030, if not in the very near term. And now I think you give stronger hand to people in the Chinese system who would say this is a really, really questionable risk, and a risk that's potentially regime threatening. And that's then
definitely
the thing. And that's the thing that you can say in a way that, you know, if the following things play out, if you have an already difficult military operation that fails, that where you're having to have where you're having Chinese soldiers killed in prodigious numbers, where you're having videos of your supposed fellow countrymen being murdered by the attacks that you're raining down on their cities. You have the rest of the world mobilizing against you, all of the companies pulling out, and you can win that. But is that a set of circumstances in which that's going to end up looking like a victory and you're able to achieve reunification? But there's versions in which you're not able to achieve that, and you have to bear all of those costs. And I think it's not certain in some of these situations that, short of obliterating the island, a kind of tabula rasa, kind of scorched earth kind of, and that's not something that I think, if you're looking at actors in the Chinese system who are willing to contemplate this, is a version of things that was really on the table. That's not what success looks like. And I mean, we've seen, and I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, you saw in Tiananmen Square, there were the points where they had to rotate certain units of the PLA away from the capital because they didn't trust them to conduct some of the operations that they were going to be telling them they had to conduct. I mean, and yeah, again, we're in a very different environment, but nonetheless, I think the net effect of all of this is, for all sorts of reasons, to give more pause and reinforce the people in the system who will say this would be a bad idea. And so in that respect, the beneficial outcome of this for Taiwan is that it probably takes the pressure that had really been building quite a lot in the last period of time, and there's more breathing room, I think, probably as a result of this.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think that you know, if people didn't already know historically that invading countries and then trying to occupy them to change them is very complicated, doing it to one that would be, you know, fairly well equipped with modern military technology and a pretty organized population it's much harder task even than, you know, like the invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq. So yeah, you really have to think that to make a decision that big, you have to be, you know, somewhat willing to sacrifice everything, you know, as a leader of a country, if you're willing to engage in that sort of conflict, because you could lose a lot. And we're still just seeing now, like, you know, how much Russia's going to lose from this. It's just, I guess we're not sure what the eventual effects will be, but already seems like there's pretty high risks involved. So before I let you go, what are you currently working on?
I'm getting a book finished right now that is, so I mean, in the middle of everything that's going on at the moment, it's
busy times.
Yeah, but it's basically looking at the rupture between China and the West in particular, but really China and the democracies, the advanced democracies writ large. What's played out over the last few years, how the dynamics that were still in not so long ago characterized by a certain amount of hope that we could kind of live together on certain terms and figure out a set of relations that were still mutually beneficial, have moved into a trajectory that are turning much more into something that is systemic competition, systemic rivalry, and not just US-China rivalry, but something that is really about how a lot of the liberal democracies are having to deal with a version of China that they had hoped they would not have to deal with, and a lot of this, and the book looks in particular how far the economic and technology dimensions of this are the factors that have really tilted the balance on this. Book focuses quite a bit actually on what played out over the 5G battles in recent years as a sort of prelude to a lot of to a lot of this. But yes, that's being finished up. But in the middle of all of this, the even wider systemic competition and rivalry that then pits China and Russia in different ways against the liberal democracies is playing out too. So so it's that's the near-term focus in the last 2 weeks as well, when I'm getting the manuscript finished.
Well, I guess the good thing is you won't be bored anytime soon. So
that is always true with China.
So what's the best way for people to keep track of all your work and everything that you're doing?
So Twitter is good. What is the handle? Andrew JW Small or AJW Small. The website I keep sort of reasonably updated, and once all the book stuff goes live, I normally keep the articles and things updated. That's andrewsmall.org. So those are probably the best ways. Otherwise, I'm at the German Marshall Fund, and there's plenty of things that they keep updated on my activities there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been incredibly interesting, and lots of information to absorb and think about in the coming days, weeks, months, even years for the world and what's happening. So
I really enjoyed the chat. Thanks for having me on.